Welcome back from the break. I'm Uday. Pratap Singh. You're joining us on NewsX as protests rage across China against its draconian COVID policy. Let's take a look at why the outrage of residents in China is justified. China, remember, has failed to produce an effective vaccine. So-called COVID officers locking people in their homes, assaulting and arresting people. This is the dictatorship under Xi Jinping, which is now facing the threat of revolt, and rightly so. On the other hand, in absolute contrast, is democratic India under Prime Minister Modi. We've not only successfully vaccinated our population, but we have also provided vaccines for other nations. Indians now walk mask-free and COVID-free due to the efforts to ensure each individual is taken care of when they faced COVID. Yes, we did have our fair share of challenges, but the response to it has brought India to where it is today. India is now a country which has a majority of its population, including vulnerable sections of society and children, thrice vaccinated at least. Almost everyone we know has gotten the vaccine. If they have not, it's been out of personal choice and not because of the lack of resources. That is the country India is, one that values its people and their choices and has ensured enough awareness is spread. Despite the pandemic, the Indian economy is fast growing and is in fact predicted to be, remember, top 3 in the next 5 years. China, on the other hand, is facing the worst economic slowdown it has ever seen due to the domino effect of China's harsh COVID measures. Remember, this has disintegrated its economic and social fabric that we see around us today. Joining us at this point to examine this story further is Ambassador Bhashpati Mukherjee, former diplomat. We also have Dr. Sanjeev Bagai, Chairman Nephron Clinic, joining us live. Also with us is Dr. PSV Rao, Consultant Surgeon, Manipal Hospital, Hebal, Bengaluru. Madhav Nadapat, Editorial Director of the Sunday Guardian, is also joining us live. Ambassador Mukherjee, let me begin with you first on how you are viewing the contrast in the handling of the pandemic and also the situation today in China and in India.
Well, there couldn't be a greater contrast. I'm so glad Dr. Rao is here. I fully recall the record time in which the weak China COVID vaccine was approved by WHO and how much time the WHO took to approve our vaccine. And at that point of time, the Chinese were giving a lot of advice, free advice, unsolicited advice to countries like India on how we should handle our lockdowns, etc. Because at that time they were recording figures which were so low that it seemed ridiculous that how can such a huge country like China have such few infections at a time when countries like India, United States, etc. seem to be reeling under wave after wave of COVID. And you're absolutely right about democracy. Democracy works very well because yes, we went through one harsh lockdown where we learned some lessons, including about how to help our migrants. We had our huge food stocks, so we were able to make sure that nobody starved, nobody, the poor and marginalized were looked after. And as we came out and as our vaccine got approved and we went through the first dose and the second dose, the government took over the administration of the vaccine, which was a very wise move, and then we got a booster. And I am told that in China, large swaths of the population have not been given a booster at all. Moreover, very soon into the lockdown, the government took the advice of our medical experts, our doctors, etc., and they started introducing what is called small local lockdowns, which is that if in one small area there are, let's say, 100 infections, that small area would be locked down, but not an entire metropolis. And because of that, we were able to ensure no disruption of economic life. It comes back once more to the fact that it's a democratic government, it's a strong government, it's a government which listens to suggestions made by its medical profession, by media, by civil society, etc. And that obviously works better than Xi Jinping's draconian zero COVID policy, where recently apparently there was a horrific fire where people could not be rescued because the building had been locked from outside as a zero COVID policy of Xi Jinping. So I am not optimistic that these protests may lead to much unless there's an internal coup. But certainly they are building up pressure on Xi Jinping to modify, his zero COVID policy, because China can see for itself that at a time when the rest of the world is enjoying the World Cup, what is happening within China. It's a stark contrast, and that is not something that Xi Jinping can stop. He cannot stop the Chinese people from seeing what is happening outside China and compare it with what is happening inside China. Uday.
Okay, stay with us, Ambassador Mukherjee. In fact, let me take that straight across to Professor Nalapat as well before I get in. A much needed medical perspective from Dr. Rao as well, who's also joined the panel. Professor Nalapat, clearly, contrasting scenarios in how India and China have dealt with the COVID situation, where we stand today, where they stand today, the kind of draconian measures used, the kind of dictatorial way they've dealt with it, the kind of democratic way we have dealt with it, and also vaccinated our citizens.
Well, I'd like to point out that under Prime Minister Modi, we had voluntary vaccinations. Till today, Uday, we don't have a vaccine mandate. Unlike so many other countries where it's mandatory for citizens to get a vaccine, in India till now, we don't have a vaccine mandate. And despite that, the Prime Minister succeeded in a record number of vaccines being administered, well over 1 billion. This is actually some kind of a world record, especially in voluntary vaccination. The first point. Second point, we developed 2 excellent vaccines in India. One, of course, was at Oxford, and it was transferred to Serum Institute of India, one of the best vaccines, which, as you correctly said, the WHO dragged its feet on. Even today, the WHO expert, Soumya Swaminathan, doubts the virtues of every vaccine except the Indian vaccine. I think I don't know, somehow she seems to have a complex that being Indian, she should show that she has absolutely no, if I may say so, regard or respect for the country. But having said that, 2 very successful vaccines, successful in not only preventing COVID, but also in ensuring mild infections. So this is the situation. At the same time, we didn't have a lockdown in 2021, a national lockdown. We don't have a lockdown in 2022. 2021, don't forget, COVID was much worse than in 2020. In 2020, Prime Minister Modi, along with every other world leader, went along with the opinion of experts. And frankly, they all went along with that, went along with the lockdowns. But I think Prime Minister Modi, unlike other prime ministers and presidents, learned a lesson. 2021, no lockdown, no mandatory national lockdown, no COVID vaccine mandate. And at the same time, the situation in India today is virtually normal. I'm here in Bangalore airport, catching a flight to Bangalore to go to my university, Manipal. Absolutely normal. Everybody is normal. And that is the situation. That is the difference with China.
Yes, it certainly is. Dr. PSV Rao, come in here on, on the contrast, on what really has worked for India, what has not worked for China, despite these stringent, draconian, dictatorial measures being taken, that their citizens are rebelling, but are still imposed.
Good afternoon, Uday and all listeners. See, there is a drastic difference between how China has gone about managing this problem compared to India and many other parts of the world. And this I had highlighted more than a year back in one of my articles in the Sunday Guardian. Now, let's see. When you hit the economy by drastically, compulsorily, and like Ambassador Mukherjee said, with drastic measures, you lock up everyone. And that too, you lock up uninfected people with infected people. It does the exact opposite of what we do by quarantining. When we have an infectious disease, we quarantine the infected person and follow up the people who are exposed to that person. We don't go and lock up the whole crowd. There was a time when I was exposed to anthrax after operating a patient in CMC Vellore. It didn't mean that they locked out the whole hospital. They put me in quarantine, put that patient in isolation, and when I proved to not have the infection, I was let out. The whole place was not locked down. You start locking down whole places just because of one person testing positive. You are actually exposing the rest of that crowd to that person who is locked down with them. So it doesn't make scientific sense. Not only it doesn't make economic sense, which all of us are aware of, all that people are short of food, people are short of employment, people are short of ability to be with their children, all the children are locked away. So these things have is very obvious. And like Ambassador Mukherjee said, there was a fire incident where no one could escape because you had locked up everyone into that building. So these are all issues. Now, let's see, why is China now suffering from the disease point of view? One, they have a very infectious homegrown Omicron variant called BF7. Okay, then these initial clusters were in schools, hospitals, and in old age homes and in construction industry. If you see how they went about their vaccination, one issue is all known to all of us, that their vaccine was ineffective. And their ego prevented them from importing vaccine from India because they had been trying to run down Indian vaccine and create problems for Indian vaccine through their WHO, which they had in their pocket. Second, I'll come to why their vaccine is ineffective also. Second, they had a very poor vaccination drive and they had misplaced priorities. I had written this in nearly in 20, when these vaccines came in itself more than a year back in Sunday Guardian, that surprisingly, unlike the rest of the world, their priority was not the people with comorbid conditions, it was not the elderly, it was not the doctors and hospital workers. Their priority initially for all vaccination was the armed forces. And then the industrial workers. This is ridiculous. I mean, you protect the people who are more likely to get the infection. No wonder now the clusters are in the schools, in the hospitals, and in the various other old age homes, etc. And now it has spread. And you are locking up everyone, infected, non-infected, everyone together. Okay, now poor communication, compulsory vaccinations and lockdowns will obviously bring resistance in any public anywhere in the world. Now about the vaccine. Why was the Indian vaccine successful where their vaccine was not successful? Their two main vaccines used killed vaccine, like what our Covaxin used. Now, what happens when you inject a killed virus into the body? The body will just scavenge it. It's not going to react to it. It will say some dead viruses and dead microbes to be got rid of. Hence, you have to put an effective adjuvant which will make the body react to that dead virus. This is where the big difference between Covaxin, which India produced, and through ICMR and the Indian scientists, and what the China has produced. Obviously, their adjuvant was not effective. So the dead virus that they put into their vaccine was all cleared. So they had an ineffective vaccine. They made it a huge ego issue. They tried to sabotage our vaccines, and the end result is now they don't have the face to import from India or from anyone else and use that. So they have an unvaccinated crowd. If you take the percentages that they themselves have put out, less than 50% of 80-year-olds are vaccinated. Forget booster dose, vaccinated. Less than 60% of people above 60 years have been vaccinated. Children have not been vaccinated. So you are asking for trouble. Now, one other issue. We have in India successfully managed even viruses for which we didn't have vaccine. I'll take the example of Kerala in that. The Nipah virus, there were 2 outbreaks in West Bengal in the year, some years back, in 2001 and 2007. And the bigger one in Kozhikode and Malappuram district of Kerala in, I think it was 1918. Now, what they did was, India had a well-oiled vaccination machinery right from the beginning. Our network is very effective. It does polio vaccination, measles, everything. So, whereas they were focusing on children, getting them to focus on the entire population became much easier. And the good communication by the Indian government ensured that there was no anti-vaccine protests like there in the West, nor this thing, mask and anti-COVID measures in India. And there was cooperation from everyone. This is, and the good vaccine and the vaccine thing managed. Now let's get back to the Nipah virus. We still don't have vaccine for Nipah virus. We still don't even have a vaccine for the SARS virus. How are they controlled? They were not controlled by extensive lockdown. They were controlled by quarantine of people who are infected and contact tracing, restricting the people who have been exposed and till they are proved to be safe, and then taking various anti-spread measures like mask for airborne infections, contact and anti-vector measures for mosquito or infections spread by various insects. So these are basic, simple measures. You don't lock down a whole population because there is one case somewhere. This is where the big difference is. And if you start locking down people for months together or repeatedly, this is what you're going to get. How would you like to, you feel as if the whole population is in jail. This is the feeling that the population will get. What kind of cooperation are you going to get after that? This is the problem now is the ego issue has come in. It will be very depressing for the Chinese leadership to accept that they made a mistake and they should have followed what the rest of the world was doing. And definitely they don't have any face to import vaccines from India and follows India's example. Having made fun of us, we had parties and had those cartoons of comparing what is happening in China with what is happening in India. For all the disinformation they did, for all the parody they did about India, what face do they have now to import Indian vaccines?
Yes, yes. I also want to quickly bring in, an opinion on how the economy has also suffered of China. That's also quite interesting, Ambassador Mukherjee, despite realizing how badly their economy has been affected, how they're falling from from month to month, and India is actually soaring. The economy is also a contrasting story, isn't it?
But naturally, Uday, if you're going to have zero COVID policy with draconian lockdowns, your productivity will go down. And moreover, since COVID spread to many of the areas very rapidly, which were supposed to be covered by the BRI, etc., so it also meant that extensive Chinese investment outside China did not meet with the expected results. And since they decided, as we just heard Dr. Rao, that they were going to only focus in a very narrow totalitarian way on their workers and their armed forces, and they did not go by medical advice, which our government did, on how to first cover the seniors, then go down the population, and then produce a vaccine safe for kids, and by that time develop the necessary confidence in the general public and in mothers who would allow the little children to be vaccinated. There is a whole process of vaccination and building public confidence, which also boosts economic activity. In China, it was the opposite. First, the Chinese government, who refused to allow the WHO to conduct any independent analysis about how COVID originated in Wuhan, then made fun of us, as Dr. Rao said. I still remember how there were so many stories about people having beach parties and terrace parties, etc. And one used to wonder that how is it possible that China has been able to secretly vaccinate its entire population so that they have no COVID while the rest of the world is struck down with COVID. But now look at how the wheel has turned 180 degrees back to that country from where the virus originated, where because of their extremely poor governance and their dictatorial approach to public health, their approach to their own people, they have absolutely caused a crisis which is only going to go from bad to worse, because as again our medical practitioners had told us during the lockdowns, etc. And I remember doing so many programs with Dr. Rao when I was locked up in Delhi, that we came out of it and as restrictions were gradually removed, by that time the public were also aware of what Dr. Rao just told us, which is the importance of masking, of sanitizing our hands, etc. Because we didn't want to go back to what we had suffered during the first lockdown, which was quite a long lockdown for many of us. We'd never experienced any lockdown in our lives. Nobody had. So I think although economic activity suffered in the first lockdown in India, after that, the economy has been booming because we've learned how to live with COVID becoming from pandemic to endemic. Whereas in China's case, it has become a pandemic when for the rest of the world it's become endemic. And why has it become a pandemic when for the rest it's an endemic? Is because of very poor governance, authoritarianism, and possibly Xi Jinping thinking that he knows better than Chinese doctors who may have given him the same good advice privately as what Dr. Rao is giving us on national television. It's quite possible that the Chinese medical fraternity may have identical views to what Indian doctors have. After all, these are all doctors, physicians. They may have told him. He obviously didn't want to listen to anyone. He doesn't want to listen to anyone. So I think that given the kind of internal unrest there is in China, while there is no democratic mechanism there, I think Xi Jinping must be feeling very, very uneasy, as they say in English. Uneasy is the head that wears the crown. I think he would have to possibly get some vaccines, if not from India, from others. And he would have to also rethink his COVID policy, listen to sound medical advice, that it doesn't make sense when you lock down infected with uninfected, and that affects in a big way your economic production, your ability to bully the rest of the world by saying, we are China, we have the greatest economy, we are ahead. Well, it's coming down very fast, so Xi Jinping should do some thinking for a change and maybe listen to good advice given to him by others.
Clearly showing the world, also Professor Nalapat, on how a democracy can deal with a situation of a pandemic and how badly a dictatorial regime can deal with a pandemic. So clearly a difference between democracy, how countries should strive towards democratic procedures, democratic regimes, and not authoritarian ones, which have failed, including China, and also the impact all of this has had on the economy as well, which affects people's livelihood on ground.
I want to point out that, please, it's not the rest of the world doing well and China doing badly. A lot of the rest of the world also did very badly. Look at Europe. Look at the United States. They did very, very badly compared to India in 2021, even here in 2022. So it's not just a question of democracy and dictatorship. Many democracies in Europe completely failed compared to India. The United States completely failed compared to India. If you had gone there, you would have seen the situation for yourself. It was chaotic. And in India, things got under control. In 2021, there was no mandatory lockdown. There's never been a mandatory vaccination. So I'd like to say, and we're a billion plus people. True. And we're not a billion plus rich people. We're not Swiss. We're not Scandinavians. We are Indians who have been bludgeoned by so many years of colonialism. And despite all that, we have done extraordinarily well. So I would like to say the experience of India under COVID, under Prime Minister Modi, is an example to the whole world.
True.
So far as China is concerned, today's young Chinese are not the Chinese of the past. The Chinese of the past, you can whip them, you can do anything you like, you can make them run in circles or in squares, but they will not protest. Today's Chinese are young Chinese, they are upwardly mobile Chinese, and they find that their jobs are not there, their incomes are not there, and they're not willing to put up with this kind of authoritarian rule unless the authoritarian rule gives them 5 times more income. Instead of which, it's reduced their income by 2/5. So this is the situation in China, and this is where people are getting upset that today's Chinese, they don't get, the dictatorship was supposed to provide economic growth and prosperity. It did to some extent under Deng Xiaoping. Today, you've got no economic growth and no freedom, and that's intolerable for young Chinese in particular.
Absolutely. Let me get a quick last word from Dr. Rao. We're running out of time, so quick 30 seconds to you and we'll close then, Dr. Rao.
Yes, I think there is a lot to learn from past mistakes, both for China and the rest of the world. We also need to see how we successfully stop Nipah, Ebola, and SARS viruses without having a vaccine for it. And here, where we have effective vaccine, our success should have been much more. And we also need to realize that whenever there has been an outbreak of any of these viruses, the host country has taken immediate measures to limit the spread of the virus, which was exactly the opposite of what China did. And I think somewhere down the line, the Chinese government has to be made to realize that what they did was a very nasty thing, where they allowed all the international flights to spread the virus all over the place. So once you have spread it into an international situation, different countries handle it in their own different ways. And the differences are there for us to not only observe, but also to learn from, so that next time we don't get into this. And people have to know the difference between selective quarantining to large-scale lockdown, where you ruin the entire economy. You asked about the economy. Remember, in India, the lockdown didn't affect the agriculture sector at all. The food logistics were not affected. These are all important things. It's not just your manufacturing. It is also your, remember, we scaled up the manufacturing of PPE, suits, gloves, and various hospital equipment and oxygen supply. So if you had the entire country under lockdown, you still allowed all essential services to function. You allowed the agriculture sector to function. You ensured free food for all the poor who were affected. This is the big difference between India and what the rest of the world was doing. This is where we have to compliment our Indian government. Plus, it had a very well-oiled vaccination machinery, and it was put to work, and the software app also made a huge difference to how the vaccination drive went on. This is a success story which the whole world needs to learn. Thank you.
Absolutely. My thanks to all of our guests for joining us.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.